So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we'll be having a training on, it's one of our Lunch and Learn, part of our Lunch and Learn series. We are here to really explore the intersection of grief and human trafficking. And this training will be about an hour and a half, so we'll be done around 30. You'll have enough information to hopefully give you some insight into this group, this population, and the challenges they face. And then we are also joined by Kristi House, which is our nonprofit in our community, but you'll learn a little bit more about that soon. We have our Q&A open. You can, any questions you have regarding the presentation or anything that comes up for you, I encourage you to ask your questions in the Q&A. I will be able to dedicate time at the end of the training today to answer those questions. Okay. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do this in partnership with Kristi House is because next month it is Child Abuse Awareness Month. And so we thought it was a sort of a good introduction into this month and a very important issue. So I'm Julissa. I am the Director of Programming for the Children's Bereavement Center. I am also a licensed mental health counselor. And I'm also joined by another one of my team member, which you'll see, she was just speaking earlier, Bridget. Bridget is our training and program manager. She will be monitoring the chat, answering questions in the chat, and also looking at the Q&A for us as Patricia and I present. So if you have any questions or anything, you can direct it to Bridget. We also have Patricia Ascorbe, our prevention and education specialist from Kristi House. She will be doing sort of the majority of the presentation today that will focus a lot on human trafficking and the impacts of that on this population. So some of the learning objectives for today, you will be able to learn a little bit about the unique impacts of grief on survivors of human trafficking, and also identify some of key losses, some key factors that they are experiencing when it comes to grief and loss outside of the loss of a loved one or someone they care about. And also you'll be able to really explain how trauma impacts this population. This really will allow you to become more trauma-informed, more grief-informed as you are working with these individuals. And so, you know, a lot of what we do at CBC is focused on grief. And so I wanted to really start our training today focusing on traumatic loss. Right? Exactly what is traumatic loss? What are some things you will observe in individuals who have experienced traumatic loss, and just the impacts that they face, which is very common in individuals who are survivors of human trafficking. So traumatic loss is something that can happen unexpectedly. It can be violent, and it can create different experiences for those who are grieving. These factors can really lead to a sense of shock, and of course trauma to those who are grieving. Survivors tend to struggle with a lot of unanswered questions surrounding the loss. They really have a challenging time making sense of the loss, right? So they may ask, why this happened? Why has this happened to me? There's a lot of confused thinking that can occur with traumatic loss, and really it can lead grievers to a more complicated aspect of grieving. There's also a lot of post-traumatic stress symptoms when it comes to individuals who experience a traumatic loss. So who these individuals, even if they didn't see what has occurred, even if they haven't found the body, even if they weren't present, they don't need to witness the death of a person to suffer from from PTSD symptoms when it comes to grief. They can experience a lot of nightmares. They can reimagine, they can be right back in that moment, even if they didn't witness it. So it's important to know that a griever's imagination can really lead them into this stress reactions that are very common. So, these individuals who have experienced these types of losses, who are grieving these complicated losses, basically their beliefs and understanding about how the world works has been shattered. And so they can be left with a sense of mistrust against the world. They don't trust others. They don't trust themselves sometimes. Um, they can isolate and really not see their grief and their trauma for what it is, right? Or to work on it at least. Those who have experienced traumatic loss, especially those who have particularly violent aspects to their losses, have more intense grief symptoms, right? And so now they're working on not just their grief, but also the trauma that is associated with it. I think a few of us may have heard of ACEs, right? So um, ACEs are adverse childhood experiences that have a long-term impact on our health, on our well-being. As we grow up, some of us experience some really challenging experiences, right? And grief can be incorporated or can have lead to additional ACEs for a person. So if, let's say, a child loses their primary caregiver and they don't have anybody else to take care of them, it really leads them into housing instability, right? They may have to go to a family member that they don't know. They might have to go into the system to be taken care of. And they might experience a level of neglect and abuse in this process, right? Um, and so grief can be sort of the starting point for a lot of these individuals who have experienced, who have high ACEs, right? High levels of ACEs when it comes to trauma, to violence, to a lot of the issues that they experience. Also, not just grieving the loss of somebody, but just having instability in the home, being able to process future loss, being able to process future trauma. It can really lead to this numbing and isolation. People, when they are in survival mode, they don't have time to really think about grief and loss. To a certain extent, being able to sit and process grief is almost a privilege because you have the space and time and capacity to go into that, to really work on those emotions, to really explore what's coming up for you regarding grief and loss. But when you are in survival mode, you do not have the ability to do this. You're focusing on getting housing, on being able to be financially stable, food, right? These are our basic needs that we need to focus on. So when someone experiences a traumatic loss, they may not be able to focus on their grief until years later. A lot of times we hear a lot of grievers say, I didn't know that my grief had such a big impact on me because it's been so long. It's been such a long time since I had this experience. And now is when they have the capacity to really explore that. So again, it's important to consider ACEs when it comes to some of those more challenging grief responses and a person's ability to really regulate their body, regulate themselves as they are working on trauma and loss. So some symptoms of complicated grief can mirror PTSD. It's important to know a person's mental health before they've experienced a level of trauma or a level of grief where did they suffer from depression, did they suffer from anxiety, right? A lot of these symptoms will be amplified after a traumatic event or a traumatic loss. So some of these complicated grief can mirror this PTSD symptoms, right? So they are re-experiencing the loss. So that means that they're right back in that moment. They're reliving it's happening again. There are a lot of people who are unable to sort of move forward from those images and sort of into a space where they're now accepting the finality of the loss or the circumstances of what's happened, right? Accepting doesn't mean just denying what happens or like accepting that it was an okay thing to happen. Sometimes when people try to find meaning in their grief and their loss, it makes it really hard for them because a lot of these times there's just no meaning behind it, right? There's just a traumatic experience that has happened and there's no sense of meaning. So they might be really re-experiencing a lot of these loss symptoms. They may be avoiding certain places or things that might remind them of the traumatic event, the person, the loss, anything. So they might stop visiting certain places they used to visit. They might avoid certain people that they used to connect with as a way to regulate themselves and their trauma, right? And not really focusing on what's happening for them. And there's, of course, this increased physiological arousal that happens to them as a result of that traumatic loss. And so also there are some similarities between grief and depression that is important for you to know. But not all of it. You want to be able to distinguish the difference between grief and depression. So you can be working from a different viewpoint as you're working with this population, right? So although grief, there are some distorted thoughts, depression has more persistent negative thinking, right? In grief, for the most part, a lot of grievers have a more gradual acceptance of their loss. It doesn't mean that they get over their grief. They are able to sort of move forward with their grief, including the emotions that come up, the sadness, maybe the anxiety that comes up with it. But in depression, there is a more difficulty accepting the loss, right? And it kind of leaves a person stuck in a more darker space. And grief has a lot of fluctuating moods. For those of us who have experienced loss, you might know one day you're really enjoying a really beautiful memory of this person. And then at night you're listening to a song and then now you're back right down into like a little bit of sadness because you're missing this person. So there are a lot more fluctuations when it comes to moods, when it comes to grief, but depressions, there's a little bit more of a persistent low mood. So just for some things for you to consider as you're working with this population, the different mental health um, challenges that they're experiencing. There is also an aspect, especially with those who are survivors of human trafficking, that there's a concept of disenfranchised grief. Really, it is a type of grief where it's not really acknowledged, where the experiences that they've had are are not really seen, are not really accepted, are dismissed in a way. And there's a grief in that because it really leaves people feeling isolated. There are sometimes taboos associated with a lot of this type of grief. So people don't talk about what's coming up for them. They may not even validate their own grief as others don't acknowledge their grief, right? So they start questioning, like, should I be feeling this way about what's happening or who I've lost, or, the different losses that I've experienced or the different events that have happened to me. Is this like a valid thing for me to be working through? Is this a valid reason to be grieving? So there is this concept of disenfranchised grief that is really challenging, to connect with those who are not even acknowledging it for themselves, that, hey, this is a real thing to work on, to work through, right? Because some society may not see it as a real loss or a real trauma in a way, or there's just some taboo associated with that. There's also a lot of shame and guilt when it comes uh, to grief. A lot of people really experience this blame for what has happened to themselves, for what they've experienced, for what they've done to sort of be able to survive. Um, there's survivor's guilt, being alive when others who may have gone through the same situation or um, are not here, right? So there's a sense of just survivor's guilt, being alive when maybe they feel they shouldn't, and others didn't have that same um, ability. There's also a lot of isolation. I mentioned the social taboos that add a lot of shame and guilt to people when they start processing their traumatic losses. There is a lot of shame and guilt that comes with that. And this really prevents people from really talking about it at all with anybody, seeking support, really understanding what they're feeling, because shame and guilt are so strong to keep people silent. It really keeps a lot of people silent in many ways, especially those who have traumatic circumstances, such as those survivors of human trafficking. And there's this judgment, right? Now people are judging themselves. I should be moving on. I'm here. I survived. I'm alive. I'm sort of moving forward with my life. I shouldn't be so focused on this traumatic thing that happened to me, right? I shouldn't be so focused. There's this timeline that I need to be on to move forward. And that's just not how grief works, right? There is absolutely no timeline. People, um, even years down the line, can still feel very intense feelings of grief and experiences of grief. It can feel like you're right back in that moment. And so, really clarifying this misconception of what grief should look like, or moving forward after traumatic loss can look like, is important and can be very validating for people who have experienced this type of losses. So how do you support these individuals who have experienced traumatic grief? So we really want to begin with just allowing them to do this exploration of how traumatic loss has affected them. Just a general information about what does traumatic grief looks like in the body, in the mind, around us, right? Um, Encouraging pro-coping responses. So a lot of times people might try to numb using anti-coping responses of some negative coping mechanisms. They might indulge in a lot of addictive behaviors. They might overwork, or they might focus on somebody else, and they're not really focused on what's happening with themselves, right? So we want to encourage this exploration of their grief. We want to encourage those positive coping responses. And this can mean maybe leading into some type of advocacy or volunteering that can really help them feel like this can be transitioning into something more positive for their end. And they're sort of envisioning their life after this traumatic event has happened. And part of being able to move forward with your grief after a traumatic loss is building on this post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth doesn't happen fast, doesn't happen easily, but it can happen when people accept support and are able to really engage in a lot of, really take advantage of those supportive resources, challenge those sort of negative core beliefs that are preventing them from really seeking the support or seeing themselves in a different way, right? And in a more positive way after this traumatic loss. And also a lot of how they see the world. Like I mentioned, this traumatic loss can really shatter the view of the world, and it can lead to such a mistrust. So really seeking safe spaces, safe people where they can sort of start feeling, regulating their body, regulating the system, and seeing the positive spaces in around them and right in their environment, and then helping them really make more mindful choices for their lives, for themselves, as they're moving forward with this. Building on resiliency through creative means. At the Children's Bereavement Center, we really do a lot of we incorporate a lot of creative art, music. We have partners that have offered mindful strategies, yoga. These are so good because it gets people out of their head into their bodies and help them regulate themselves, especially as after such traumatic losses. And like I mentioned, that is part of the somatic work. So we want to allow people to really explore what somatic practices feel good for them, feel good for the body, feel very regulating for them. So this is just some of these practices, some of the things that we would encourage you to do, to work on, to as you're working with populations who have experienced some traumatic losses. I am going to stop right here. You may have some questions, but I am going to pass it on to Patricia so she can continue really digging more into this when it comes to survivors of human trafficking. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Patricia, you can share yours.
Thank you so much, Julissa. That was very interesting information. Specifically, the disenfranchised grief, that was something new for me to learn. So thank you. I'm going to bring up the slide here. And thanks for having us here today. My name is Patricia. I am part of the prevention education team at Kristi House. We are Miami-Dade County's Child Advocacy Center. And I'll speak a little bit more about what we do, but I just want to make sure everyone can see my screen first. So if anything in the chat, let me know. But if I don't hear anything, that means we're good to go. So this portion of the training, we're going to be perfect. Thank you, Christina. Our Director of Prevention Education is also on with us, so that's exciting. We're going to be focusing on human trafficking. We're going to talk about pretty much like who's at risk, what is it exactly, what are the different types, and we'll get into really in some engaging conversation. But before that, we want to always thank our donors, because we wouldn't be able to do this work and provide this free prevention education without the donors to Kristi House. And this training is and has been approved by the U.S. Department of Justice, and we have again been awarded some different program funding for this. Due to the topic that we're talking about, whether it's grief, traumatic stress, we understand that these topics are not easy. So we just want our audience to know that we are going to be touching upon topics that are sensitive. So sexual exploitation, violence, trauma. And we just want you to be aware that we encourage you to practice self-care. If at any point in time you need to step away for a moment or, take a little bit of a breather, please do that. We want to make sure that this is a safe space for everyone. So, our mission at Kristi House is to protect children from sexual abuse, trafficking, and other childhood trauma. So, we basically are the one-stop shop in Miami-Dade County for any child that has experienced any type of trauma. And we provide therapy, we fight for justice for our children. We're working within our community with our community partners, like we're doing today, um, to make sure that our kids are safe. And we are the only CAC in Miami-Dade County. We are responsible for coordinating the legal, medical, and social service needs of the children and families that we service. And we're also one of the first child advocacy centers in the country to address human trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation of children. And we do this through our Project Gold program, which is girls and guys owning their dreams, lives and dreams, and we offer direct services for those with lived experience of human trafficking through that program. All of the services that we offer at Kristi House are absolutely free of charge. Some of the things we're going to cover today, again, what is human trafficking? What is the textbook definition of that? What is the scope of the problem? How big is this issue? We're going to tackle some of those myths and misinformation, as there is a lot that's out there. And we're going to talk about the different types of trafficking, specifically sex trafficking and labor trafficking. What are some of the vulnerabilities? And who are human traffickers? As well as touching upon how do traffickers recruit, especially using an online platform, identifying individuals who may have lived experience, and talk about the importance of our words and how that matters in both helping those with lived experience and spreading awareness. And we'll close off with some resources for everyone. So let's start with human trafficking. What is human trafficking? So there's different categories to this, right? So sex trafficking, let me click the slide so you see that. This is the textbook definition. I won't read it verbatim, but it is defined by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person, again, for the purpose of a commercial sex act. Okay? There's three terms that are important here: force, fraud, or coercion. And for any adult that has lived experience, these three elements are present. As we move into CSEC, or commercial sexual exploitation of children, this involves a range of sex crimes and activities that are involving sexual abuse or exploitation of a minor for the financial benefit or anything in exchange of value, if you will. Okay. And I don't know if you've noticed a difference in these definitions where the elements of force, fraud, and coercion are not necessarily present for CSEC because children are already vulnerable, right? And adults are responsible for their safety. So this can be done without those elements of force, fraud, and coercion. Then we have labor trafficking. So this is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, again, for forced work. And as you see here, we have those three elements pop up again: force, fraud, and coercion. And there's an important note at the bottom of this slide that when we're talking about children, again, those three elements doesn't necessarily have to be present. It's been removed from the law in Florida. So these are the three different human trafficking types. Sometimes there's a confusion between trafficking versus smuggling. So we like this slide because it kind of shows us what makes it different. So with smuggling, there's a contract that's made up front of, hey, I'm paying this amount of money so that the smuggler can transport me from one border to the next, or over the international border. With human trafficking, there doesn't necessarily have to be transportation over an international border, and there's no real contract. There may be an idea of one, but it's not abided by, if you will. Smuggling is voluntary. It is someone that is choosing to do it, whereas trafficking, someone is manipulated into it or forced into it or force under false pretenses. With smuggling, there's a business relationship. Again, once the smuggler does gets somebody across the border, that relationship is done and everyone goes their separate ways. That's not happening with trafficking. Um, that business relationship never really ends. So we're going to be, oh, can you all hear me okay? I just saw the chat.
Yeah, I can hear you. If anybody else is experiencing audio issues, let us know. I can hear you fine, Patricia.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to transition to the scope of the problem. How big is this problem really? So just the International Labor Organization has put out that human trafficking is over a $200 billion industry, and that's worldwide. That's huge. That means there's a lot of push for this, unfortunately. 1 in 3 teens will be approached for recruitment within the first 48 hours of leaving home and becoming houseless. And so those 48 hours are really, really critical because a trafficker can see that vulnerability of a need of shelter, right? And they will promise shelter and the world. And a child who's out alone is going to probably go for that and say, well, yeah, I need a place to stay. I need to stay safe. Um, the average age of entry into commercial sex industry is between 12 to 14 years old. And this might be surprising to some people, right? Because it is fairly young. Polaris, which is a national organization that gathers a lot of these numbers through their hotline, estimates that the total number of victims in the United States can reach up into the hundreds of thousands. So, just with this slide alone, we know that the scope of this issue is massive and there is a problem here. So, Florida ranks third in the US. I'm curious to know if you want to share with me in the chat what states do you think are first and second? You can share in the chat what your thoughts are. Michelle says New York and California. Rebecca, New York, California. So, a lot of New York and California. Definitely, yeah. Florida's number 3, so we're definitely in the top 3. Texas, yes. So California is number 1, right? They have an international, there's an international border. There's a lot of agriculture in that state as well. And it's a huge state to begin with, right? And the second would be Texas. Texas is again another very large state with international border, close to different port, the water, open waters, and there is also a large agricultural aspect there too. And with Florida, we may not be as large, but we do have, right, the open waters. We have Cuba not too far away. Puerto Rico, well, Puerto Rico, I wouldn't, is part of the US, but other different countries, right? Dominican Republic, Haiti, things like that. And it's not to say that human trafficking is only when people from other countries are being trafficked, right? That does happen. But you'll see as we go on in our training today that it's more often just happening in our backyards. Another one, yes, Stephanie, I heard yes, Miami-Dade County is number 1 in the state of Florida. So we're the highest concentration for human trafficking reports. That is true and correct. Yeah. And we have a very large entertainment business here too, and tourism. So that adds to that. So here is a graph of the Florida Abuse Hotline reports alleging human trafficking per state fiscal year. So they received about, within the last, between 24 and 25, over 2,000 reports of human trafficking. Now, about 80% of those reports involved female victims reported, while about 18% involved male alleged victims. Now, I do want to note that male reports are highly underreported. So we understand that there are probably more male victims than is actually reported and shown in the numbers. Now, another highlight I wanted to keep on this slide is that more than 81% of the children involved in these trafficking reports were living at home with parents or other caregivers, and only about 18% were children in out-of-home care. I think that's a significant statistic that overwhelmingly these are children, again, living in these are community children, um, going to school every day, and in our backyards. So this chart illustrates the distribution of out-of-home placement settings at the time a human trafficking report was made. So you'll see here residential group homes, runaway or out of home, missing from home, correctional placement, and just kind of gives you that visual. These are some of the investigative findings. So out of all the reports made, right, only about, and these are reports that, again, could go off of suspicion, calls from DCF, things like that. Out of those over 2,000 reports, only about 596 cases were verified as human trafficking. And that's sort of what this graph is showing here. And again, it was predominantly female victims that we were seeing. So this leads us to training and prevention. Providing training and using the right screening tools helps people recognize the signs of human trafficking. Human traffickers bank on the fact that we don't talk about these topics very much, right? With our kids, with our friends, with our families, and it lives in silence. So we want to break that barrier. And through training, through awareness, through education, equals better identification and screening. And not just for first responders, but for everyone. So now we're going to go into some of those myths and facts. Now, looking at this slide, and feel free to let me know in the chat, how many of you are familiar with some of these images? Have you seen these images portrayed in the media or in your communities? Let me know. Yeah, so Kendra's like, yeah, these are pretty familiar. Sarah, yes, I have. So the media often perpetuates these misconceptions or these images that this is what it looks like. And the truth is that it doesn't. We're not necessarily finding large amounts of children tied up, right? And chained in rooms. What we're seeing is children that are being solicited online, children that are being human trafficked while parents are away at work, and traffickers are taking them to a motel and then dropping them off back at home right before mom and dad get back home. So that's more of what is more of realistic of what's happening. Not to say that there are not instances where there may be a child that is completely physically isolated and confined, because there have been those instances, but it is not what we want the people to think of immediately, as that's not the majority of the cases. Most trafficking victims are not physically restrained. Instead, what's being controlled is their mind, psychological tactics that traffickers are using to put the chains, really, if you will, of the mind instead of the physical body. And some of you may be familiar with the movie Taken, and it was a good movie. But this is often a movie that's associated with like an example of what human trafficking looks like. And again, it portrays victims being abducted, being caged, being chained. And while these extreme scenarios, again, have occurred, they only represent a very small fraction of what's actually happening in reality. And what that does is um, it almost hides away the true victims of this crime. Because if a young child, is coming across these images and they are being trafficked, they're going to think, well, I'm not being chained up. Nobody's, forcing me to stay anywhere, physically. So that can't be me. And so they're less likely to go and get the help that they need or recognize that they themselves are victims of that crime. So we definitely want to be careful of, what kind of images we're portraying. So some myths and facts. There are many myths and misconceptions that people have about human trafficking. So the International Labor Organization reports that 16 million people are exploited in the private sector, such as domestic work, construction, agriculture. This is a fact. This is indeed happening. The myth is that all human trafficking involves commercial sex. We understand that it doesn't. Yes, that is one type, but we also have labor trafficking. And at times, some of those go hand in hand together, where you have the two forms. Human trafficking can happen in industries such as restaurants, cleaning services, construction, and factories. Yeah, that's a fact. It's happening in front of our eyes sometimes. And the myth is that this only happens in underground industries. People being trafficked are physically unable to leave their situations, locked in or held against their will. We just talked about that, right? So that's definitely a myth. We know that that is not the majority of the case. The fact is, even though there may be those circumstances, the real trafficking situations are more complex and more complicated than that. Only women and girls can be victims and survivors of sex trafficking. Again, we understand that this is a myth. It's not true. And for many years, the conversation has been male trafficker, female victim, right? So I always encourage us to kind of challenge that because traffickers can look like anyone. They can be male, can be female. Doesn't even matter what kinds of jobs they hold, right? And so I just challenge us to kind of break that thinking so that we can make sure that we're not missing anyone that may have this lived experience. Again, one study estimates that as many as half of sex trafficking victims and survivors are male. Many survivors have been trafficked by romantic partners, including spouses, and by family members, including parents, and this is a fact. We have seen these are different forms of trafficking, and traffickers only target victims they don't know. That's a myth, right? In fact, many times it's through people they do know, and then that connection kind of keeps bringing them more people to be trafficked. Okay, so we're moving along right into we're going to talk a little bit deeper about sex trafficking and what that looks like. So there are different forms of trafficking in general, there are also different forms of sex trafficking. Excuse me. The first being the trafficker and pimp trafficking, which I think many people are kind of more familiar with. So this is when there's that third party who's kind of brokering the exchanges of the sexual act, again, for something in exchange like money. Typically, it's going to be money, right? And again, traffickers can be of any age, any gender, and any background. Then we have gang trafficking. This is typically done as part of initiation into a gang and for money, and the gang member is involved directly in the trafficking of the victim. Familial or family-controlled trafficking. This type of sex trafficking occurs, again, when a family member or guardian sells a minor for a sex act. We have seen cases where minors have been sold by family members in exchange for drugs or even in exchange to cover their rent. And sometimes it may be a landlord, right? That's saying, well, if you don't do this, then I'm going to kick you out to the curb. So that's some examples of familial trafficking. Transactional sex trafficking, this refers to a form of sex trafficking where really there's no third party involved controlling that situation. Instead, it's the individual that's engaging in the commercial sex act, again, in exchange for things like food, shelter, protection. It's think of, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? This is where you see a lot of that transactional sex trafficking. We've also, typically boys or young males will find themselves in a transactional sex trafficking situation. Sex trafficking can take many forms, and individuals are frequently subjected to multiple types of exploitation in different environments. So we have pornography stands out because that's a huge area where we see a lot of human trafficking or sex trafficking. But here are all the other different types of environments or forms, if you will, of the sex trafficking. These are some examples to put some of the definitions we talked about into examples, like a mother allowing her landlord to have sex with her child just to cover the rent, right? A female advertising in adolescence for sex online is another example. Or even a nightclub owner providing shelter and food for minors in exchange for exotic dancing. So these are just some examples. Going back to the topic about our young males, and how we know that it's very underreported that they come forward, right, and disclose this information. There has been some new research on this. So male victimization, again, vastly underreported, and we can think and we can challenge ourselves on why that might be, right? Is it societal? Is it cultural? There was a study with homeless youth in Philadelphia, Phoenix, and Washington, D.C. that found that of youth who were sex trafficked, 31% were male and 56% were female, and 13% were transgender. And they were often sold in male-specific venues. Again, young men and boys are going to be less likely to have that pimp in brokering things. It's more of that transactional sex trafficking for in exchange of those basic needs. And they're largely recruited by their peers and what we call peer recruitment. So between 31% to 71% of youth impacted by commercial sexual exploitation are male. And males more often report having one episode of child sexual exploitation before or during adolescence than females. And there's that 61 versus 39%, right? The males versus the females. And reported to more likely have repeated events of this than females, 71 versus 29. And that was a study conducted in 2022. So young males who have experienced commercial sexual exploitation, there are a scope of risk factors and outcomes. And there are, thankfully, more research going into this. And hopefully we learn more. That way we can better serve them. And some of those risk factors that have been found amongst males who have experienced sex trafficking include their home environment. So, what does their home environment look like? Are they able to depend on the adults that are supposed to care for them? And if they're not able to depend on them, going back to the beginning of our time together, right, where Julissa was talking about grief and loss, that could be seen as a type of loss, right? They may still have physically two parents in the home, but if that child cannot depend on them, that can elicit a sense of loss, right? Are the parents on illicit substances? Is there a history of emotional abuse or physical abuse or sexual abuse going on within the home? This causes a risk factor for them. An unstable childhood. Thinking about involvement with the dependency system, right? Foster care, whether maybe the family is houseless or homeless, a child that is continuously running away from home, or what we like to call missing from care, right? Usually a child is running away because they don't feel safe where they're at. Um, any sexual encounters at a young age, any history of arrests or problems with the law at young ages can be risk factors. Then we have demographic and systemic factors. We understand and we know because the research shows that African American youth are at higher risk than other groups. There are higher risk in rural areas compared to metropolitan areas. Is there exposure to violence in their communities where they're living? And then we know that members of the LGBTQ plus communities are also at higher risk and are more vulnerable. And mental health plays a huge role. Whether these mental health challenges are coming from drug use or um, any using illicit substances, maybe they are also having or expressing depressive symptoms. Again, trauma can be complex, right? So if a child has already experienced certain traumas, unfortunately, they are more likely to possibly experience something like human trafficking or be more vulnerable or susceptible. So we're going to transition into the second type of human trafficking, which is labor trafficking. And you'll see that there are some similarities between sex trafficking and labor trafficking, besides the fact that this is not necessarily involving forced sex, but it's involving forced work. But the tactics used are very similar. These are different forms of sex trafficking. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have domestic servitude, forced labor, debt bondage, involuntary servitude, child labor, and slavery. And then on the right-hand side, we have the common industries where this type of trafficking is found: agriculture, restaurants, entertainment business, even door-to-door sales or peddling and begging. So and oftentimes, domestic servitude, to be more specific, is seemingly a normal practice, of hiring live-in help that's used to cover, but typically it's used to cover for exploitation, right? In some, not typically, but in some instances. So someone is promised, hey, we'll have you come live with us. You'll make a decent wage. You can send, money back to your home, your family. And everything seems peachy. But then once someone gets to the home, their identification documents are taken away from them. Exploitation begins and the control begins. So, how do we identify labor trafficking victims? And again, I use this slide because I think some of this can be intertwined with how to identify victims of sex trafficking. Not everything, but there are some things that overlap. So the control and coercion, right? When someone is not in control of their own identifying documents, they don't have their ID, they don't have their visa, they don't know where it is, or a passport. They're threatened with deportation, they're threatened with arrest. Um, and I'm going to tie it in with some sex trafficking too. Like if a child is sometimes threatened that if they, for example, and we'll talk about this, but if they don't send more images of themselves, they're going to be blackmailed by their images will get posted everywhere, right? So a lot of the threats is a common theme. The working conditions, going back to labor trafficking, so there's no clear contract. They're working long, rigorous hours. They live and work typically in the same place. I'm not going to go through each and every one, but just for the sake of time. But personal and well-being and behavior, so they may appear very frightful, fearful, and anxious, hypervigilant. They may show signs of poor health and hygiene. They may not really be allowed to speak for themselves. And then recruitment and movement. They may have been recruited under false pretenses. Again, promised job, promised live-in work, decent working conditions. They may have a large debt that they're just unable to get on top of, or they've been moved frequently. So now we're going to move into vulnerabilities. So traffickers look for people who are vulnerable. And that word has kind of two different meanings for me personally, right? Because vulnerability can be a really powerful thing in different contexts. In the context that we're using today, vulnerability is seen as, for a trafficker, a way to manipulate, right? Um, a way to find someone that is easier to exploit. So let's talk about what those vulnerabilities are. So many individuals who experience human trafficking, they share certain vulnerabilities that traffickers are looking for and they deliberately target. For example, individuals with a history of abuse or trauma. As for a trafficker, they're thinking if this person has been abused before, um, they're probably easier to manipulate. Runaway and homeless youth for the mere fact that, again, children depend on adults to take care of them. They can't necessarily just, provide for themselves. So the traffickers know that they're going to have to lean on another adult to get those needs met. People in poverty or with financial instability. Many times traffickers will get to know a child or build a rapport with a child, and eventually a child may disclose, well, my family's really struggling to pay rent right now, or my family's really struggling to pay the light bill. And a trafficker will swoop on in, right, and say, well, I can help with that. And there's just an avenue there that can be exploited. People with substance use disorders, um, it's known that traffickers will use drugs and alcohol to keep um, victims coming back. Individuals with mental health issues or intellectual disabilities, again, especially if they're being untreated and sometimes undiagnosed, children and adolescents, just because they are children and adolescents, right? And they can't necessarily protect themselves in every situation.
Patricia, do you mind if I
Yes,
chime in really
please
quick?
do.
Yeah, I just wanted to really also talk how grief can, in fact, this is close to what I was talking about, the ACEs and their vulnerabilities. In all of these, you can really see the grief and loss that can lead people to having a history of abuse or being runaways or homeless or that financial stability. If the primary breadwinner has died, then the whole household may have to come in and support the family in a way. And it leads to these vulnerabilities that Patricia is talking about. Substance use. A lot of times there are people who I mentioned earlier about the numbing that some individuals try to do as they are working on their grief. And a lot of that numbing happens through the use of substances, which makes them more vulnerable for human trafficking as well. So you can see how grief can be a part of all of these different maybe lead people to more grief and loss and more challenges within the human trafficking or vice versa. Right? Just wanted to chime in.
Yes, thank you, Julissa. That is right on the money, right? Grief is kind of almost like it can be an underlying vulnerability for all of these things. I did mention at the beginning that we would talk about who the human traffickers are, and I know I've stated that they can look like anyone, and that is really the truth. There is no single profile or stereotype to be able to look at someone and say, oh, they're the trafficker, right? Um, they can be any ethnicity or race, anyone, it's really anyone who benefits from the commercial, sexual, or labor exploitation of a minor. Um, they're not always organized criminals, both men and women of different ages. A trafficker can be a boyfriend, an employer, father, mother, uncle, coach, teacher, or anyone that's exerting control over a minor or even a peer. Um, Few children are swept off the street and thrown into white vans. Instead, they're being trafficked by people they know or who form relationships with them for the specific purpose to exploit them. Um, Sometimes they continue going to school. Students will go to school, come home, and be trafficked. They're living at home, as we talked about earlier, that 81%. And they're even participating, I'm talking more of the victims here, they're even participating in extracurricular activities while they're being trafficked. Um, so now that we have that information, right, we can go back out into our lives and understand that it can be anyone. It can be anyone. And to have these conversations with the children that we care about in our life. One thing that's also important to know when talking about traffickers is how do they do this? What are the tactics? The first thing that they're going to want to do is isolate. They're going to want to break any supportive bonds that that child has. Friends, family, any supporting adult, they're going to want to take that child away from them. Creating fear if they leave their trafficker. So instilling fear in their mind that if you were to leave, your life is going to be even more miserable. Using manipulation to make the victim question their capabilities and mental stability. And that's that psychological jail, if you will, right? Making them believe that they're unable to fend for themselves, that no one's going to help them or believe them. And then rotating acts of kindness with acts of violence. And this is what creates the trauma bond. So specifically speaking about that first tactic, which is to isolate the victim and break the bonds with their support system. The more the trafficker can make the victim believe they have no one to love, protect, and understand them, the more control they have over them. And again, because we're also talking about grief and loss, once you break that down in someone and they feel truly that there is no one else that will protect or love them, that has to bring about a lot of grief. Um, so just kind of keeping that in mind as we move along, right? That traffickers, if anything, see that as a huge vulnerability, the fact that someone is or may be grieving. Um, so isolating them again from their friends and family, moving the victim sometimes to another city or state so that they have no one to call or nowhere to go for help. The second tactic is the use of fear. So traffickers will often instill fear through threats of violence or harm directed at the person being trafficked or even at their loved ones, saying, if you were to tell anyone, I know people that can hurt your family. As a result, they're going to feel compelled to stay where they are and to do whatever the trafficker wants them to do. Um, excuse me. This fear is often reinforced if the trafficker has previously been violent toward them already, showing that if I say something like, I'm going to do it, these are not empty threats, right? Sometimes they'll even threaten to kill the victim or someone they love. The third tactic that traffickers use is psychological manipulation. And I think all of them are bad, but I do think that this one is almost like the scariest because this is where we see um, where those who have experienced this, all the tactics before of like they have no one to protect them, like this is where they 100% believe this. Um, they're questioning their own abilities. They question their own mental stability. They're repeatedly exposed to lies and demeaning messages about themselves, and this will cause the victim to truly internalize that. And you might see some similarities here between this tactic and the same tactic used in domestic violence relationships or abusive relationships. It's the same thing, right? This manipulation strengthens the trauma bond between the trafficker and the victim, leading the victim to become increasingly dependent on the trafficker, even for the most basic things, whether they need to ask permission to shower, eat, or even sleep. The fourth tactic, yes, thank you, Michelle. Power and control are at the center. Absolutely. This fourth tactic, the rotating acts of kindness with acts of violence, right? This is extremely confusing, especially for a child who only wants to be loved and protected and feel like they belong, where the trafficker will shower them with gifts, love, and affection. And then the next day, they're being physically abused, right? So the trafficker will promise them love, will promise them, to marry them, to have a family with them. But then on the same token, they are making the child feel a lot of shame or self-blame for the things that they're doing, right? Or even for trying to question the trafficker. The victim feels trapped and believes there is absolutely no way out of this situation. And the truth is, if there is some truth to this, is that it is very dangerous once someone recognizes that they are a victim of this crime and they want to leave. That's a very delicate and sensitive situation because it can put them at risk for their life. Okay. So the intersection between digital technology and human trafficking, what we've seen since post-pandemic is an incredible increase in how traffickers are using online platforms to recruit children. Significantly, there's just a lot more access to children online. We have online commercial sexual exploitation, sex trafficking going on, sextortion happening. Traffickers continually evolve their digital tactics, again, leveraging those new technologies to enhance exploitation. Individuals can be lured across great distances, including across country and state lines, while others are exploited remotely from their homes. Many individuals experience trafficking report initial contact with traffickers that occurred online, highlighting that digital recruitment method. There are times where a child may never meet their trafficker, and everything is conducted online. Which leads us to some of the apps that I think professionals, parents, and families alike need to be aware of. So traffickers frequently exploit on social media platforms like Snapchat, Instagram, there's TikTok as well, but this is a slide that highlights some of those apps. I would say any app that a child is on or any gaming platform that a child is on that where they can communicate with other people, that there are chances there that traffickers are luring. So it's so important that we talk about these things with the kids in our lives and that we're vigilant and monitoring what they're doing online. There's even a hidden calculator app, if you see here on the top right, where it's like a message. It's really, the calculator is hiding the actual messaging app behind it. So in April of 2025, last year, Kristi House hosted actually a Lunch and Learn series, and one of the presentations was facilitated by Tamia and Tim Woods. During their presentation, they shared their son's story, James Timothy Woods. And James was a vibrant, dedicated 17-year-old student athlete who ran track and cross country. He was known for his kindness, his energy. Basically, everyone loved him. Unfortunately, due to sextortion, James became a victim of sextortion and then took his own life in 2022. In response to that event and that loss, and I can only imagine the grief that his parents were going through, they used that to propel them to create a foundation in his name called Do It for James Foundation, where they go around and they spread awareness of sextortion and support youth mental health and honor James' legacy through education and outreach, and even scholarships for runners, young runners. And so that's just one small story, right, of how sextortion can affect many lives. But sextortion is pretty much blackmail. And what they will do is they will use an online platform to ask for sexual images of a minor and if that minor either A, doesn't send them or sends some and doesn't send any more, they will harass the child. They will threaten the child. Again, they're going to ask for money for that from that child. They may even ask to meet and have sex with that child. And this all falls under sextortion. So, how do we keep kids safe in social media? We need to educate ourselves, right? And stay up to date with the ever-changing technology and apps, and that can be very tiresome. But it's important. And to know what are the safeguards to each of these apps. Check the kids' devices frequently and thoroughly. Set appropriate parental controls, age restrictions. Discuss the apps and different sites that your children frequent. Educate children on the dangers of oversharing. And most importantly, is to maintain an open communication line with the child. So relying on the relationship of a trusted adult is really one of the best safeguards. And just remember, a child's safety is more important than their privacy. So as a parent guardian, you aren't being nosy, right? You're checking their phone regularly. You're being cautious. So we're going to move into the impact of trauma. The impact of trauma affects every aspect of a human being, right? And that's any type of trauma. I know we're talking about human trafficking, but we know trauma in general affects our psychological health, social impact, our physical health, emotional health, and our spiritual health. And due to the high levels of trauma and violence that are experienced by individuals who have been trafficked, they do require specialized support that address their physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, and social well-being. The impact of trauma is complex, and it does have long-lasting implications on survivors. And trauma reveals itself in many different ways, right? Depending on the person and what their life experiences have been up to that point. So it's important that we're able to recognize signs so that we can show up and help youth by using trauma-informed approaches. And that includes acknowledging um, grief and loss in all of this as well. So trauma bonding, we talked a little bit about this. We kind of grazed the surface, but trauma bonding is a biological occurrence related to emotions that make people more important, or that makes people more important to each other, and is influenced by the time spent together. So traumatic bonding occurs as the result, again, of these ongoing cycles of abuse with those intermittent um, times of love and adoration, right? And it becomes very confusing for for the victim. So there's this misuse of fear, excitement, sexual feelings that kind of entangle another person. And there's a strong emotional connection to that or attachment to that. So when the person is engaged in an abusive relationship, again, something as simple as bringing them flowers or, taking them out to a nice dinner, that can reverse in the victim's brain of like, okay, well, there is a possibility here that things could be different, so I'm gonna hang on. These are some, oh, let me go back. Let's see here. Some major indicators of trauma bonding. So they may show a lot of symptoms of PTSD. They may be extremely grateful for minimal acts of kindness, almost kind of like that saying now, it's like the bare minimum, accepting the bare minimum. Um, Denies violence when violence and threats of violence are actually happening, and they rationalize that violence. Well, it can't be too bad because at least, it's not like, he broke my arm or anything. He just left a small bruise, right? Rationalizing the violence. Denying anger at the exploiter to others and to self, and the others that you see listed here. And I think the next slide also has some more. An example could be, right? If I smile and don't complain, she won't get mad tonight. Again, trying to placate with the trafficker, or tries to get into the trafficker's head, right? I always tried to guess what they wanted before they said anything. If I could figure them out, I can keep things calm and I can, keep the abuse at bay. And these are some more examples. So seeing the exploiter as a good guy or a protector, seeing the exploiter as even a victim. Well, they've been through a whole lot in their life too. And that's, you know what? We can acknowledge that that can be there, but it doesn't condone what's happening in real time. And I know I have about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to skip ahead. Well, I'll do this slide and then I might skip ahead a little bit just to keep with our time. Um, these are some possible signs that a person may have experienced or is experiencing trafficking. There's going to be behavioral signs, whether that's someone being really fearful or anxious, or even just having overt submissive behaviors. That could be a sign. Physical and health indicators, signs of malnourishment, any tattoos or branding as well. Social or environmental cues. So they may be accompanied by a controlling person who insists on speaking for them. In fact, I don't know if anyone has seen The Pit, but it's a great show on HBO Max. And they have a scene where a young woman actually comes in who is suspected of human trafficking, and she's with another woman who just continuously speaks for her. So that is an example of what that can look like. Getting to the language. Language is a powerful tool. And again, it can either build up courage for a victim to speak up, or it can tear someone down, depending on how we are talking about this topic. And this quote I really love by Mark Twain. It's the difference between the almost right word and the right word is the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning. So again, just showing that impact of what language can have. This is also one of my favorite slides. So the Polaris Project put out an article entitled Language Matters, 5 Ways Your Words Impact Trafficking Survivors. And I'll highlight a few of these. So words like the term like rescue turn people off from getting help. It's too dramatic, right? We're not swooping in, and they're not like hanging off a cliff and we have to rescue them. Um, when they are in this situation, you don't think you're being trafficked. You just think that this is your life, so you don't recognize yourself. And this is a quote from an actual, from someone who's lived through human trafficking. Another one is the saviorism, right? So you can't rescue a person being trafficked. What you can do is create an opportunity for that person to leave. So again, being mindful of the words that we're using in the different settings that we maybe work in or socialize in could be the difference between someone recognizing that they are, in fact, experiencing this and getting help. So, survivors are more than what has happened to them, right? Language often reduces survivors to their circumstances rather than emphasizing their amazing power to survive. They are a whole person. They don't want to be viewed as a label. They want to be viewed as an individual first. So we don't want our language to um, minimize that. And here's, yeah, some of the things I said here. So just being overly, just being mindful of the words we're using. These are some protective factors. So I know Julissa said was talking about the ACEs. There's also, the protective factors as well. And this is a list of those. Having supportive adults and trusted adults around them is a huge protective factor. Um, Learning consent and refusal skills, which is what, we go out into schools and we teach kids about. Awareness of trafficking in general, having their basic needs met, and so on and so forth, as you see here on the screen. I mentioned earlier that we do have a program at Kristi House that provides direct services for individuals who may have experienced trafficking. We service them, I believe, I hope I have the ages right, I think 12 to 26 years old. It's a drop-in center. It's not a residential program, but it is in an undisclosed location, and they have therapy, individual and group, as well as like life skills training. There's incentives to go to school and get jobs, basically to get them back on their feet and create an environment of empowerment. These are just some key takeaways as we wrap up. So again, who's at risk? Anybody, right? Though marginalized and vulnerable groups are especially at risk, it can be anyone. It can be someone coming from a two-parent home, or it can be somebody in foster care, right? It can be anyone. Red flags to look for or warning signs. Watch for those behavioral cues, physical cues, and changes in their habits. And what is our role? Our role is to recognize the sign, and our role is to report what we see and respond with that trauma-informed lens. Some of you may want to take a screenshot of this slide. This is pretty much where you can report. So you can call the abuse hotline, which is 1-800-96-ABUSE. You can report online. You can also text Fix Stop. This is through the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office. These are all ways you can report, and I would just encourage you to put these phone numbers in your phone as a contact. And I think these are some more, yeah. So some more specific, right? To Florida, we have the SAO, Fixed Stop, Florida Abuse Hotline, and then the national hotline, which can be both phone or text. It's 24/7 confidential. And that is it for my time. This is just information on our team, but thank you so much. It was a pleasure to share this information with you all. And I'll give it back to Julissa.
Thank you, Patricia. I appreciate this is such great information. I want to open it up for questions before I just talk a little bit about what we do at CBC. Any questions in the chat or in the Q&A about anything that we presented on today? This was so useful. Great. So let me just quickly share a little bit about what we do here. So at CBC, we have several grief support groups. We have support groups that are free of cost, 100% free of cost to the community. We have our Lift from Loss adult division, which focuses on support groups for adults as well. So we start at the age of 4, all the way up to adulthood of any age. We have some virtual groups that happen on a weekly basis. It doesn't matter the type of loss you've experienced. So if you experience a loss due to illness, accident, suicide, or homicide, you're welcome to join our groups. We also have some dedicated groups for those who have experienced the loss of a child, those who have experienced pregnancy and infancy loss. And we also recently started our pet loss support group as well. So we also have in-person groups in certain locations. I'll talk a little bit about that, but it's pretty easy to register for our groups. All you have to do is call our 888 number, and our intake staff, which speaks English, Spanish, and Creole, can help guide you through the intake process. We really do not have a referral process, a referral, or we don't have a wait list. So anyone can join in as soon as they're ready. You can take a picture of this slide. You can scan the QR code, and it will lead you to our forms to register for groups. And we also have several, just like today, this is our Lunch and Learn, which we have periodically with different topics. And we have our Steps for Healing, which will happen on November 7th, but we're preparing. It is our annual 5K. We have our Lunch and Learns, we have our conversations, and these are more self-care and wellness for those who are grieving. And then we also have several community pop-up events as well. So I encourage you to join our newsletter so you can keep up to date into all of the different events that we have going on, whether it is online or in person. We are also at the Children's Village at Lotus House. So this is a great location for us. We have support groups, in-person support groups at this location now. for adults and for children. It's located in Overtown area. It's such a beautiful location, and we're really excited about the groups that are happening in person. So now there's an opportunity to join us online and in person as needed. So I again follow us on social media. You can go through our website livefromloss.org and follow us Instagram, Facebook. You can just find a lot of great resources on there. And you can also copy the QR code. This is a recorded training, so we will also post it on our website. I know some of you have also selected for CEs. So the training is free. CEs about $25 per CEs, but I'll send additional information for you to you on that for all of you that joined in. That is basically all on our end. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Kristi House. This was such invaluable information.
Thank
We
you
are
so
so
much.
happy
It was
you joined.
our pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.